You are listening to another episode of the Caffeinated Christian Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Willard. I'm sitting here with Pastor Mike Rigglesworth and Bradley, your man with no last name, here as well. How are you guys doing today?
Oh man, I'm good. Bradley, it's been like forever since we've seen you.
I know, it's been a long time.
Yeah, he's abandoning us and we don't like it. We don't like it whatsoever, Bradley.
You know what it is? You guys are, you're such northerners. I'm just embracing the southern identity that I've established.
Is this like a caffeinated Christian like civil war going on? Is this what you're trying to start up here?
Maybe.
Well,
we have all the Bones coffee and Disney down here. So I guess we win.
That's true. Disney. Can't blame you for Disney. But today, before we start about the podcast and the topic that we have a good topic for you. We are going to introduce the coffee that we are drinking. So I have two things right now. I have my water and I have my Seattle's Best coffee. I had to go decaf. I've already had 2 cups today. And I switched over. I'm trying to eat more healthy. I'm trying to have less preservatives. I'm going to have less GMOs, all that stuff. I switched over to Chobani creamer versus like International Delight. And it like takes out like 10 of those like artificial, really not healthy things for you. And I find it really, really good, actually better than the typical creamer that we are having. So it's Chobani French vanilla creamer and my Seattle's Best coffee. Bradley, what are you drinking?
I got the tried and true. Well, to honor you guys in the north as well, because you got your first snowfall. I'm drinking the Bones coffee eggnog edition.
Beautiful.
Did I give you that, or did you buy a new one?
I don't remember. I've bought so much coffee since I've been down here.
Okay, because I remember I gave you a little box of the leftover ones before.
Yeah, you did. This might have been in there because I don't really like eggnog, but so it might be one that you gave me. But yes,
it's pretty good.
It is good.
Okay.
Mike, what are you drinking?
We've seen your oversized cup like 10 times so far. So what are you drinking in there?
Bigger than you right now.
What am I drinking? So I'm drinking out of my Wesley Seminary cup. That is my alma mater for my master's. And I am drinking coconut rum coffee.
Ooh.
Bones one?
Bones. It is Barissimo. It's like the Aldi's brand coffee.
Oh, okay.
But they have halfway decent coffee. I gotta hand it to Aldi. But the sad thing though is, Ryan, you mentioned that you switched over to decaf and you've only had 2 cups and that kind of stuff. I'm realizing my limitations with caffeine consumption these days because I had a cup of coffee after 3:00 last Saturday, the day before I'm going to preach, right? And I could not fall asleep for the life of me that night. And I'm like, why in the world couldn't I fall asleep? My wife's like, you had caffeine. I'm like, so what? She's like, you're 37. I guess so. Okay. But yeah, this is what I'm drinking. This is going to be my last cup of the day. Otherwise I won't sleep.
I feel that, Mike. It's funny because my dessert for each day is a Coke Zero. I'm trying to go down on weight, and I have to have it before 8:00. The other day, we were out doing something. We did there was a discount for a couple's painting class. And so it was a blacklight painting class. So we went in there and everything was blacklight with the neon paints and stuff like that. And I came home around like 8:30 and had a Coke Zero. It was literally like at midnight. I got up and I took a little Benadryl to be able to knock myself out because I was like office marathon in the bedroom while Sarah's sleeping next to me. I was more awake than I was at noon. I was like, this is going to be a disaster. I got things to do tomorrow. So I took a little sip of Benadryl because that stuff knocks me out. But I was like, this not doing that again. That was a disaster.
Would it bother you guys to know that I drink coffee before bed and sleep perfectly fine?
It doesn't bother me at all. I used to be able to do that in my 20s. Yeah. Enjoy it while you can, Bradley.
I am. I'm going to enjoy it.
Yeah,
Bradley.
It won't last forever.
Once you start having to ice your knees after like running outside, you probably won't be able to have coffee past 8 o'clock at night.
Once your knees just hurt you, but just by virtue of waking up in the morning, you won't be able to have coffee after 3 o'clock.
Exactly. When you
Um,
sneeze and your ankle cracks, no coffee.
Fun fact about Benadryl, Ryan. I thought one day, my daughter was probably about a year and a half old. I thought I gave her Zyrtec because she had like a pretty bad cold, and it was
Oh
to
no.
help clear her out. And I gave her Benadryl, knocked her right out. She slept for like 3 hours.
I one day before I went to storage, I was gonna take Motrin because I had like severe like migraine going on, and I was like I'm running late. I popped and I took 3 Benadryl. I had to call my uncle who was my partner and say, "Hey, I won't be able to make it today." And for the whole day, it was as if someone like put something in my drink. I was just in and out of sleep the entire day because Benadryl crushes me. 3 of them instead of Motrin.
Wise decisions, Ryan. What are we talking about today?
So we have a great podcast for you today. Good transfer, Mike. And I'm sure you guys have heard of this because it's what is it? Roughly a month old, but we had some things lined up already on the docket for you guys when in terms of podcasts. So we wanted to make sure we don't like bypass it, and we wanted to talk about this conference that Stanley just held at his church. Have you guys heard about it? And if so, what have you heard about this?
So the unconditional conference is the name of it, right?
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've heard about it. I've listened to some interviews of guys who have actually attended the conference, and getting the feedback from it has been, without getting into too much of my commentary, because that's going to be the subject matter of our discussion here. Is it was very, very interesting, and but there seems to be a consensus around it within the evangelical community, which we'll get into now. But just on its face, um, I think it's a topic that we do need to be having a better conversation about.
Yes.
So in theory, I'm not against a conference like this, but I do have a lot of follow-up questions to Andy about how he approached it. So yeah, but
Yeah. Bradley, have you heard anything about it?
I'm a little less informed than you and Mike are about it. I got that podcast link, but I couldn't watch it because you sent it through my Android phone.
Oh, great.
Um, so I did look it up. I have like a baseline knowledge. Like Mike said, I thought it was interesting to say the least. But I'd be interested to hear what you guys thought of it, more detail about it before I give any more statements.
if you don't know, can you fill them in, Ryan?
Yeah, so it was held at his church, and I first want to start off by saying this is secondhand testimony, I should say, where we are getting this from scholars we follow who actually went to this weekend long retreat from the unconditional sort of ministry to help. And the goal was this to help parents better embrace and love their child who struggles with either some sort of transgenderism and or same-sex attraction. So that's the first thing I want to disclaim. And the second thing is I do think from everything I heard, because I went down a rabbit hole and I listened to his sermons, I listened to probably way too many hours of people discussing this topic. And I do think some discussed it well. And I do think some were very poor at going after this topic. But I do think there was some good information, right? So we'll first say that, for instance, like avoiding tribalism. I thought that was a helpful sort of context where too often we look at the political arena where you're either right or you're left. And if you're either all with us or you're completely against us. And it doesn't seem to be that's the case, though later on it does seem, according to like Alan Schleman, that they did present a form of false dichotomy versus the traditional way of going about it and the new way of going about it. So I do think some of their assumptions came back at him, if I can say that way. But the whole point of this conference was for parents trying to figure out how to better handle and love and walk through life with their kid who go through these types of emotions and feelings, right? And that sounds fine and dandy, because I think as Christians, we ought to be prepared to do something along that line, to be prepared, whether your brother or sister, niece or nephew, friends, family, coworker, whatever the case may be, if they come to you with these feelings and thoughts and how to better sit down and think through these things with them, right? The problem is how it went about doing it. Now, I want to toss this over to you, Mike, because you mentioned a little bit about that, and give us more information about how this went about.
Thanks, Ryan. And I appreciated everything that you said there. And, I do want to start off by saying I like Andy Stanley as a communicator. I think he is one of the best communicators in, like just ever. He's a phenomenal orator. And he's done a lot of necessary work in helping pastors to lead better. He's got a lot of great stuff on leadership. I have several of his books in my library. So everything that I say, I want to let the listeners know this is coming from somebody who's followed Andy Stanley, who's kind of a fan of his, likes his preaching style, all that sort of stuff. I want to say that I would say hats off to him for hosting a conference to help equip parents to love their LGBTQ kids well. Like a kid comes out and claims they're transgender, claims they're gay or lesbian. We want to respond in a way that embodies Jesus. So I'm not against the idea of hosting a conference, but like you said, there's the false dichotomy that was presented, actually sort of a straw man that was presented, that said, okay, this is the way that pretty much all Christian parents respond to their kids. And that is pretty much like call them a reprobate, call them a sinner, kick them out of the house. That's a gross oversimplification, but that's basically how parents respond. But who's to say that parents? How do you know?
Right. I believe they call that the traditionalist sort of view on how to go about doing this thing.
Right. And then the opposite extreme was presented as sort of the gold standard to do it. And I don't know what speaker affirmed. I know they had open and affirming speakers there. I don't know what they provided in terms of like, this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do. You might be able to speak to that a little bit more, Ryan, but I think it was a good idea to do this conference. But I think it was either poorly executed or perfectly executed. And I don't know which one.
Yeah.
So it's a good idea to have a conference to help equip parents, but he had speakers who are both in openly gay relationships platformed in this conference. And that's the crux of this issue.
Yeah.
This is why we're talking about it today. And I think either he didn't think through the future implications of this, or he did, and he's sneakily ushering in pro-gay theology into the church. So I think either Andy Stanley is completely and totally naive, or he's crafty. Because maybe he did. There's a third option if he was apologetic, but he hasn't been apologetic at all about doing this conference. It is possible that he just didn't think through it properly and made a mistake, but he's never made a mistake. He's doubled down in everything that he's done. So given that response, he is either super naive in what this was going to do, or he is sneakily trying to usher in just unbiblical sexual ethics into the evangelical church, because he knows the level of influence and clout that he has and not only among leaders within the evangelical church, but just people. Like, find an evangelical that doesn't know who Andy Stanley is, right? So,
Right.
so that's my issue with it.
Yeah. So what also, now I'm not going to claim one of those answers, but I do think there are certain red flags that lead us to lean to one side more than the other. And the reason I state that is a few things. First, um, it's not just that he had a few, right? People who were openly affirming, um, but he had almost everyone who was opening, affirming and in same-sex marriages teaching these conferences, right? And there was this phrase he continued to use, and I believe he said that on the Sunday morning um, sermon, which I watched, about the idea like this is not about theology, this is not about biblical exegesis, this is just how we're supposed to love like Christ better. Now, to me, I think that is extremely, at best, naive to think that someone's theology doesn't have anything to say to their worldview and how you love like Jesus. Think about that. Your theology will determine this next question. What does Jesus teach on how to love someone in this topic? And to just give the fact that you're not teaching about theology, either he has no idea what theology does to a worldview, or like you said, he's very, very crafty. And I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt here. It's like you said, he doubled down on certain things. On top of that, in my pastoral work, I've written papers on his deep and wide sort of methodology on how church comes along, and I have Mike, you and I talked about this. I have very strong reservations on his church methodology, which my biggest problems, it could lead to certain things that are happening that we're seeing. And I said that years ago to you, like, we got to be cautious because I see this door being opened straight through his methodology. And then lastly, what was very interesting to me is Michael L. Brown, one of my favorite scholars. He's like a PhD in ancient Near East languages. He is a really, really good friends with him. And you go to his podcast, In the Line of Fire. It's a fantastic podcast. And he did a whole hour episode on his conversations over the past 6 years with Andy Stanley, specifically on this topic. Andy Stanley gave him in email approval to read the emails. And he continues over the past 6 years to answer a specific question. Does the Bible teach that same-sex marriage is a sin just in general, right? There's not, like, because you're going to find when you actually read the literature that there are some ways out that are very clever. But Michael L. Brown really got to the point, and he refused to answer specific questions. And because he likes to sometimes, like you said, he's very, very good at how he says things, which leads me to the conclusion that I don't know if this is just naive. And that's just me from the outside looking in, right? And let me give you some examples. And one of my favorite scholars on this topic is Dr. Preston Sprinkle. And he has a fantastic podcast dealing with this. And I try to be more like him on this topic. And he actually noticed two major things that I noticed during Andy Stanley's Sunday morning service to try to explain why he did this conference. And he then goes on this sort of discourse on what the church confirms to be true. Let me read you just two of these main points. I have a handful of them. He says this. I think he said three of them. Let me read you all three of them. Basically, the church affirms what the Apostle Paul has to say in Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6, and 1 Timothy, is it 1? Yeah, 1 Timothy 1. And that's what he said. Now, to me, that doesn't tell me anything. Okay, the next question is, okay, what did Paul confirm? What is Paul saying here? You just can't say we confirm what Paul has to say, because people who are affirming would also confirm what Paul has to say, but disagree on what Paul has to say. So it's a very sneaky way of putting that unless you go, oh, okay, let's ask the more fundamental sort of larger question, it's gonna make you feel like, okay, yeah, he agrees with me because we have a certain stance on what Romans 1 says. Okay, he agrees this is what Romans 1 says. Secondly, he says this, what Paul calls sin then is sin now. And everyone's like, okay, that's great. Like, but the problem is when you read the literature on some of these stuff, technically he hasn't confirmed anything. Because the next question is, what did Paul confirm as sin? Because there's people like in Romans 1 who thinks Paul is just talking about homosexual relationships that are overly lustful versus those who are not lustful. And you read scholars like Brownson, and they have these arguments like that. So once again, that really wasn't helpful. And then he says something like this. Sex is for marriage. The biblical message assumes it's between man and woman, and we don't shy away from that. Now, on the face value, that sounds great, right? But the problem is the Bible assumes a lot of things that we actually don't hold as true today. The question is, did it assume it? As in, is it just describing what the ancients believed, or is it a prescription? Paul is saying, no, this is what marriage is now and forevermore. And what Stanley has said in saying this is what the Bible assumes marriage to be and we don't shy away doesn't tell me if that's what they think it to be and if this assumption holds as the scripture to prescription. So it's very carefully worded to make things sound like it would agree with the historical witness of the church, yet doesn't necessarily bring you to the conclusion that we, as sort of the historical Orthodox, hold that what Christ has to say about marriage. So it's tough to see these explanations and then go, oh, that really isn't helpful to this dialogue because you didn't answer the question. On top of won't answer Michael L. Brown's, on top of it's the choice, whether naive or it's very clever on how he words things. And if we think he is one of the greatest and articulate speakers, it's tough to see him as being that naive when he's surrounded by people who are breathing into him on both sides of the story. And so from my point of view on the outside, I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt, but I have a lot of questions that need to be answered.
I have a few takes with that explanation. And like I said earlier, I'm no expert on the conference. I didn't watch any of the conference. So I don't really have like the full details before I open my mouth. But I would like to say that I find, first of all, just what you said, Ryan, I find it interesting that all these pro LGBTQ plus pastors and like philosophers, so to speak, and theologians all only cite the same like scripture verses over and over again. Like none of them, it's always Leviticus, Romans 1, and then was it Timothy was the other one?
Are you talking about the clobber passages that you see in like Deuteronomy and stuff like that?
Yeah, but they never address like in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and then God creates man, and then he says it's not good for man to be alone, so he creates a woman for the man. He never it doesn't say that he creates another man for the man. It literally, that's literally God's order enshrined right there. And they never actually like go into like detail about like, okay, like they never go into Genesis at all. They never go into the Old Testament at all, other than Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But like, it's kind of interesting that they all use the same argument and the same text to back up their argument. I just an interesting note there.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Bradley. There is a very, very dramatic difference between the affirming scholar and the scholarship on the literature and those who are going head to head versus typical pastors who, like you said, well, when you're talking, it's talking about Molech and baby sacrificing. When you actually read someone like Gagnon, who just absolutely obliterates that view, the more confirming pastors are very surface level on the research on this topic of human sexuality. So yeah, I agree with you to that point. But I do think there are some interesting arguments that try to explain through Mark 10 and Matthew 19 difference between descriptive and prescriptive and what Jesus is saying. I don't think any of the arguments are at all persuasive. And it always brings me back to this is what Jesus says. But to what you said, Bradley, I do agree that typically the typical pastor sort of reiterates these same verses over and over and over again versus digging into the literature. And I don't know why the Lord put it in me, but this topic is like fascinating to me. And one of my top 3 topics I like to continue to study.
One, Mike, do you need to say something? Go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that real quick that even within the LGBTQ tribe that they say that, hey, I follow Jesus, but I have a same-sex partner or I'm same-sex attracted. There's a disagreement on how scripture is approached, right? So there are some people within that camp who say that the Bible is authoritative, but they want to reinterpret the passages in Leviticus and in Romans and in Galatians and those types of passages. But then there are those within the camp who say, like, okay, no, we think that that what Paul is saying is exactly what the evangelicals say that he's saying. We just don't see the Bible as authoritative. So there's camps within that community that say, we think the Bible is authoritative, but we're going to reinterpret this text to affirm our lifestyle. And there are those who say, no, we believe that the Bible is saying exactly what it says, but we just don't want to come under the authority of Scripture. So it's non-authoritative for me. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but there's issues with that I think that oftentimes don't get talked about.
And something else I was going to say too, Ryan, with what your last statement was there. I find it interesting. I'm going to say that I think that it sounds too good that Andy Stanley was incompetent with what he was doing. Like it seems like it was a good idea to start off with, but then you look at all the other like mega church leaders out there. Like you got Bethel, you have what's his name? Everybody knows I dislike him, so it's not a big deal. But Stephen Furtick's church, Elevation.
Oh yeah.
You have Hillsong, like some parts of Hillsong. Some are worse than others.
Lots of reservations, yeah.
But then you got Northpoint as well, and they're all doing the same thing. They're all, coming out with like these ways to affirm LGBTQ plus people. They're all coming up with different conferences. They're all like inviting different pastors and people like with some following that live this lifestyle. It's almost too good to say that it was incompetence and it wasn't malicious. Like I don't think that necessarily he maybe was like, oh, I have like this master plan that I'm following or anything like that, or they're a part of like some secret order or anything like that. But I mean, one of the big issues that we all miss is that we live in a world that is dominated by the devil, and the devil wants to turn us against each other. He wants to do all these things. And when you give into these different ideologies, you're giving into the will of the world. And so there is some type of grand master plan, and whether we're competent enough to see it or not is really something that we have to be on guard for. And I feel like that, a lot of these big leaders have just gotten swept up in, the numbers and how many people are in service today and how much money are we making. And, the LGBTQ issue is a really big business opportunity. I mean, that's why every single Pride Month, all the companies like Budweiser, down to Target, down to all these different brands like Hershey's have the pride flag on. It makes money. They wouldn't do it if it didn't make money. So I think that there's a lot of issues that go into that, and that, it's just kind of warping the minds of some of our big leaders.
Yeah, I guess for me, I'm really concerned with this platform of, listen, we don't care what side of the fence you're on. We have to love like Jesus. And that sounds fine and dandy on the very, like, the most childlike understanding of biblical love out there. Because, like, you read any commentary that goes, well, that's false. Love is not love, period. It's just not the case. You look at someone and go, okay, Because the next question, logically, which is such a simple next question, is if we are to love like Jesus, what did he say about the issue? Because what we conclude about that issue will define how we approach each person through our understanding of love. You will not walk out on both, whatever side you pick, you will not walk out with dealing with the person the same way, no matter what the conclusion is. It just is not possible. And so to just say it's not about theology, it's not about each, it's about how to love people better is, I think, just using the word love in culture to appease people and make it like a spoonful of sugar for everything else to go down. I don't know how else you look at that. And like Mike said, it's either it was very clever or it was naive. And I agree with Sean McDowell. If that's the case, that makes that dangerous. If that is the way you put yourself as one of the biggest pastor of 30,000 people, and that's your conclusion of who that is, it's either naive or it's clever, it's dangerous. And because of that, I don't know any other conclusion but to go, this is not a good sign. It's just a good sign. And like I told Mike years ago through my methodology work on his stuff, I go, the writing's on the wall, in my opinion. Things are going to crumble. And I think we're starting to see some of this in play when it comes to the depths of theology that the Bible actually has to have. And I want to be, I don't know, I'm trying to be as right on to the Bible as possible. And if the Bible allowed it, I'm going to go, okay, right? I just look at scripture and all of the arguments and just go, clearly, it says what it says. And I really would have just wished there was better thought put into this. And unfortunately, I think there was a lot of thought put into it. So, like I said, I'm trying to be as generous as possible, but I don't know any other conclusion. On top of all of the other scholars that I have listened to, watched, and read in their conversations with him about these certain things, I don't know what other conclusion I can lead to.
Looking at it just from my perspective too, that and Bradley, I haven't watched all the conference stuff either. I've only like listened to some clips of how Andy Stanley's responded, and I read a few articles responding to his conference and his articles responding to the response of his conference.
You can watch his Sunday morning service.
It's
right after. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I listened to some of that too. But what I don't know is how he can defend this. It seems indefensible to me because he says that he holds to a New Testament sexual ethic. He says that his church holds this. He claims to teach this. And so categorically, practicing homosexuality is a form of sexual sin. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to assume that Andy Stanley agrees with that. Right. So that's where his approach becomes indefensible to me at this point. Because if you really hold to a New Testament sexual ethic, you believe that is a sexual sin, you wouldn't do what you would do with any other sexual sin in that category. Like, let's just draw out a parallel. Like, you wouldn't do a conference for parents of teens with a porn addiction and then platform people who affirm and encourage porn use.
Right.
You wouldn't do that. You would not do that. Then why in the world would you do it here?
Yeah. Yeah. And on top of what you just said, Mike, and then on the Sunday morning, he tries to answer, this is what our church affirms in three ways. And as I read before, it doesn't tell us anything. It's seems slippery way out of actually answering the bigger and more nuanced question. And because everyone on both sides of the coin, whether affirming or not affirming, actually agree with these statements, which I go, okay, well, that's not helpful at all whatsoever. And so I just am not certain if he would agree with the sexual ethic that we clearly see Bible teaching. I just don't think he agrees with it. And the fact that he can't answer his friend's question over 6 years throws up
And
flags.
he said something very telling to Michael Brown in his conversation with him.
Mm.
And I'm not going to get this exactly correct, possibly, but it gets to the heart of it. I think he said something along the lines of ministry sometimes trumps clarity.
Mm.
It's like, what in the world does that mean? Like, I think clarity is the best practice to have in ministry. And the
Yeah.
best way to love somebody is to be very, very clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very clear about what you believe around these issues.
Yeah.
To be unclear is to do bad ministry. Because at the heart of ministry is to love people. It's unloving to be wishy-washy about these things. And I understand that it's not going to be popular or profitable to take a stance on this. And I think that's the problem. The methodology that you've been studying with Andy Stanley, Ryan, I think gets to the heart of this. Like, his whole ministry model was built around, how do we get people in the seat? Right? How do we build as massive of an audience as possible? And honestly, like, I can't think of a better way to do that than have a conference around the most pressing issue of the culture.
Yeah.
And to be intentionally nebulous around my stance on it. So I'm not alienating either side of the issue. But in the process, you end up doing that anyway, right? And this is backfiring on him colossally. But I think it gets to the root of what his church is unfortunately trying to do. And I think profit and popularity has gone ahead of the proclamation of the gospel. That's just my opinion. But I think that seems to be what's unfolding here.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there is this, I think, very naive evangelicalism in this world today that we're going to do whatever we have to preach Jesus. Right? We got to tell people about Jesus, and that means we'll accept, we'll allow, we'll do whatever we need to do in order to preach the good news of Jesus. And to me, that is just antichrist, if anything. Jesus, when he preached the gospel, preached what was right and told people what was wrong. And so what follows from being like Christ is not to do whatever you can to preach the gospel. It's to preach the gospel correctly. And that involves you telling things are wrong and not accepting certain things, because the good news of Jesus is bringing in the kingdom, right? Yeah. He's the fulfillment of the story of Israel. And that kingdom will reject and regurgitate out certain things because it's not holy. And if that's the case, we shouldn't ingest them for the sake of the kingdom, because it's gonna end up sending a lot of people not to heaven who love Jesus. And unfortunately, my gosh, we look at 1 Corinthians 6, there was people in the church who claimed they were Christians and refused to do certain things. And Paul says these people think they're going to inherit the kingdom, and they're just clearly not, because they just refuse to say no to certain things. And granted, there's more context behind that, but I think that just do whatever we can to preach Jesus is a very, very dangerous thing and misunderstands the logic of the kingdom of Christ. And I think if he was standing here with us, he would agree with that statement.
I was actually gonna I'm happy I waited actually. I was gonna read a quote from John Cooper's new book. It's called Wimpy, Weak, and Woke. It's not out yet, but I'm very much looking forward to it. But he says, wimpy Christians wish to set a table where we affirm everyone's feelings, including Judas, Esau, and Jezebel. And
Right.
wimpy Christians imagine that Jesus makes them all feel validated. He goes on to further say, wimpy Christians see Jesus as a therapist rather than as a savior and a redeemer. Yes, Jesus is compassionate. He does care for the brokenhearted. He did heal the sick and the poor. But God's agenda is not to validate our feelings. His desire is to set us free, recreate us, and bring us from death to life.
That's great.
It doesn't totally make sense to me on one account. He says Christians want to set a table for Judas's, except Jesus did let Judas into his table. Like,
Sure, but
so,
but he didn't affirm Judas either.
No, absolutely not. But I think there's a distinction that we can make and should make between affirming somebody and loving them, and those two things have become conflated. Like for the LGBTQ community, that the only way you can love them is by affirming them. And actually, you know what? I don't believe that. I reject that premise.
Yeah.
I think that's false. I think, you can, just like anybody else who has sin in their life, you can come to Jesus, and as you seek him as your first love above all other things, he can restore you and give you new life, and he can give you a hope and a future. So I think there needs to be that distinction there. But by and large, I agree with the quote.
I mean, I think too, to go with what you just said there, Mike, too, like setting a table doesn't, I mean, we don't have to necessarily invite people into the church to reach them. You know what I mean? Like, so completely separate topic, I guess, but same vein. Last month, the Pope had a bunch of people come that were like in an LGBTQ like carnival, and they came and performed at the Vatican. So in like the similar vein, like, maybe the intention was to share the gospel with them in that setting, but we can't invite sin to take place in the church or in those places. So like Andy Stanley said, or like Andy Stanley did, like I mean, yeah, maybe it's really good a topic to address. But I don't understand why he would invite somebody that's partaking in sin actively into a church where you're supposed to be refuting the sin. That's the part that doesn't make sense to me. In both of those circumstances, I don't think that you can invite a sinner to church, but I don't think that it's okay to allow sin to happen in church.
Mm-hmm. And to platform somebody and give them an authoritative voice on an issue, and that's where I come into issue with what he did. I'm not saying that these guys shouldn't have been allowed to come to the conference, but there's a way to format it, where you're doing a panel discussion, right? You're having affirming and non-affirming voices talking through this, and you're modeling for Christian parents what it means to talk through these issues in a loving and winsome way. But to say, like, I'm going to have this person have 40 minutes to talk about their theology, which is unbiblical. That's where I push back on it. And to allow sin to happen in church, and to take it one step further, Bradley, to encourage and teach sin in the church is a problem too. And so
yeah, to promote heresy.
Absolutely. So I had, and like you said, Bradley, to your point, I have an actual example that happened about a month ago. How, like, we can reach people within this community outside of the walls of the church. And let's be honest, most people who are immersed in this lifestyle aren't coming to our churches. They're not. They've decided the types of people that Christians are. They think we're bigoted, homophobic, all this type of stuff. But about a month ago, my wife and I, we went on a date. There's a new place that opened up around the corner from us in the village of Lancaster called Fatty Beer Company. They have several locations in Buffalo. It's the most recent one that opened up, and our kids were at their grandparents' house for a sleepover, and we said, okay, so we've got some time to ourselves. We went there. Happened to be trivia night at this place. And there's a group of about 5 or 6 people that came into this place. And in that group was a gay couple. And the one guy in this couple was started just talking to my wife and I and asking us all sorts of questions. And he asked us, he said to my wife, what do you do? And my wife says, well, I'm a teacher. And And he looks at me and he's like, well, what do you do? Like, okay, this is about to get really it's really interesting here, right? Um, and I told him what I do. And I said, I'm a pastor of a non-denominational church in this area. And he's like, and you're married, right? He's got this idea of, Catholic in his head. I grew up Catholic. And so he just proceeded to ask me all sorts of theological questions. He's like, so what do you believe about what I do about gay marriage? Like, what do you believe about that? And I told him, and I wasn't condemning. I just said, well, I hold to what the Bible clearly teaches about it. I believe that marriage should be between a man and a woman. Anything outside of that, I believe, is sin. And I didn't get into a ton of it. Didn't get into an argument with the guy. I said, but I hold to this ethic. And he's like, okay. And he didn't argue with me. He didn't shout me down. He asked me a whole bunch of other questions too. So I think part of having a better conversation with the LGBTQ community is just, we don't like having those labels tacked on us that we're bigoted and homophobic and all these types of things. I think we have to be careful not to put those labels on them either, where we assume that they're just going to be hostile and antagonistic to us. Some people might, but that was definitely not my experience with this guy. We continued to have a conversation with him. We ended up going on their trivia team for trivia night, and we were able to plant some seeds of the gospel that day that, had we responded differently, might not have happened. So, I think
just to go with that too, I think that when in anything too, it doesn't necessarily have to be in sexual sin or anything like that. I think that if you're honest with a person, if you actually tell them what you think, you're going to have a more productive relationship, period. Mike, for example, if you like before you and your wife got married, or you, Ryan, even if you guys had like lied about major details of your
Mike's
life.
wife. I'm just kidding.
Oh, sorry. But I was going to say, if you guys like lied about major portions of your life or concealed it or like, kind of buried that truth that you hold dear, one, what does that say about, what you believe? But two, what is your wife supposed to think? Like, oh, he's going to like probably, not love me as much as he thinks or as much as he proclaims or anything like that. It really comes down to just being truthful and honest about things. And, I'm sorry, I'm the guy of quotes today. But there was a quote by a World War II veteran, and he was a Christian, and I'm not going to remember his name, unfortunately, but he had said that somebody had asked him about fear. And he said that when he runs into combat, he's not worried about the bullets that are coming after him, because he says, man's going to try and kill you, but God's the only one that can. And so likewise with us, when we're going through these issues, we're worried about all these different bullets flying at us. But the only one that can act, the one that's actually in control of the world, is God. And so, God has these things happening for a reason, and all these things that are, like, for example, that conversation, like there's a million different circumstances that could have gone through that, but God's in control of the whole circumstance. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, one, it's a fear of like, what are they going to do about my beliefs? But two, God's in control. And if we follow through with God, I mean, he's going to follow through with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely. So my last thing about this would be, I hope I'm wrong, and I'm trying to figure a way out of sort of my conclusions, and I hope there is one. I hope I'm just brutally wrong on this, and everything is what we hoped it to be, and that he agrees with sort of the Orthodox view on it. And this was just a really poor but good-hearted attempt to really help parents with children who are going through these things, right? But yeah, so I once again, I hope I'm wrong. I hope we hope the best for everything that's going over there. This is from a secondhand from people who went there and friends of his who are scholars who talk about these things. But other than that, I just we'll just hope and pray that things go well for them over there and he continues on the right path.
I would fully agree, and I like Andy Stanley. I like the influence that he largely. There's some things that I disagree with for sure, but in years past, he's done a lot of really good things to help the church. So I think it's good to acknowledge that, and I hope our listeners know this is not a piece where we intend to bash him at all, but it is just something where we're raising our concerns. That I don't know. I hope that he's humble enough to admit what he's doing and what needs to change going forward, and that we continue to engage the culture in a meaningful way without presenting this idea that we're affirming and celebrating sin. And I think that's the concern.
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of The Caffeinated Christian. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You could also find us on The Caffeinated Christian at Instagram or Facebook. And guys, if you have any suggestions or ideas on future topics, ideas for future episodes, please feel free to reach out to us there. That is at The Caffeinated Christian on Facebook and Instagram. All right, guys, until next time, have a great day.